What's going on, Skullbrains? Welcome to another episode of Skullbrain TV, and in this episode, let's see where Richard, Orkin, and Melix leap into the lake take them in this next issue of The Ancestral Trail.
When he, who is the chosen one, shall tread upon the ancient path, and battle there to overcome
the forces of the dark.
The Ancestral Trail, an epic story of myths, magic, and monsters. Book 10. Zibella's Fortress, Sorcery and Witchcraft in the Watery Depths.
That's right, in the last episode, Richard, Orkin, and Melix had escaped from Zoc the Cannibal Chief and then found a whole plantation of living death traps. Managing to survive, they set the death traps on fire, but then the fire gets out of control and they have to make a leap into a lake to escape the flames. So, let's get into this issue and find out what happens. But before we do, have you seen the Ancestral Challenge for this week? If not, go and check it out here and then come on back and join in the fun. You ready? Let's do this.
On the 10th day, landing from the witch's brew in spellbound lands of fear, battle nightmares, one, then two, ending three in crystals clear. Revoke the spell, the book will tell, testaments beginnings see. Add 4 elements, make a spell. Say the word that sets them free.
Yellow flames and smoke filled the wood behind them as Richard, Orkin, and Melix leaped into the lake. The three hit the water together, and now they were swimming vigorously. Their one aim was to get to the opposite shore as quickly as possible. There was no telling how safe the water was. If the earth itself could catch fire, there was no reason why the lake should not too. Weighed down by the Book of Prophecies on his back, Melix could barely keep his head above water. "Are you okay?" Richard asked the dwarf swimming alongside him. "Yes, I'm fine," Melix spluttered back. "I'll get the hang of it soon." Melix was as good as his word. Before long, he was moving forwards with a slow but steady breaststroke, while Orkin thrashed along in his wake like a paddle streamer. Richard swam beside them, ready to help if they got into any trouble. From the dry land, the lake had looked quite narrow, but now they were in the water, it seemed much wider. As they swam along, Richard could have sworn it was getting wider still. After a while, he turned his head to check how far they had come. He saw the same expanse of blue. There was no shore, no sign of land, no hint of anything but water. Richard trod water for a moment, trying to grasp the situation. As he did so, he felt a tugging at his feet, as if a current was pushing him to one side. He called to Orkin and Melix, but his words were drowned by a sudden throaty gurgling. An enormous plug seemed to have been pulled out from the bottom of the lake. The current gripped him with its full strength. Richard had heard of whirlpools, but he had never seen one. Now he was in one, pinned to a swirling wall of water that sank straight down into the lake. Before him, swept along by the same circular current that had suddenly risen from beneath the surface, Orkin and Melix were being carried down into a cauldron of spray. Noise was everywhere, gurgling, splashing, a jumble of buffeting sounds that drowned everything else. The three whirled round in ever-decreasing circles. The sky grew dimmer, the noise louder. Orkin and Melix had already disappeared. Now it was Richard's turn to vanish beneath the spray. Richard landed painfully on a cold stone floor. Beside him, the other two were rubbing their wet, bruised bodies. "Where are we?" Richard asked. "What's happened?" "Magic," Melix said. "Listen to this." He read from a soggy page in the Book of Prophecies. "You're right," Richard said after Melix had finished. "Witch's Brew describes that whirlpool perfectly. We must be on the shores of the lands of fear." Richard looked around. They were in a cave. A faint red glow from a single rocky passage provided the only light source. "We don't have much choice," Richard said, heading for the opening. The others squelched after him. As the trio made their way through the passage, the walls seemed to be moving closer together. The roof was getting lower. Then they heard a loud crunch behind them as roof, walls and floor met in a rocky kiss. "The tunnel's closing up," Richard shouted. "Run!" They stumbled along, chased by a gritty rumble as the passage steadily squeezed shut in their wake. Rounding a corner, they saw that the passage was closing in front as well as behind. Through its narrowing opening, they glimpsed the safety of a cave. Richard and Orkin made it in time, but just as Melek was about to dive through, the walls nipped him neatly by the book on his back. Orkin leapt forward and helped Melek wriggle free from the straps which bound him to his load. Richard made a grab for the book, but it was stuck fast, its leather cover creaking under the pressure. Richard drew his dagger and began battering the rock with its hilt. At last, he was able to loosen a stone enough to snatch the Book of Prophecies free. Then, the tunnel closed with an angry snap. A shaken Melek strapped the book back onto his shoulders while the others took stock of their surroundings. Once again, they were in a cave with only one way out. Richard was about to speak when the tunnel floor seemed to come alive, creeping towards them, rustling, twitching, crawling, a brown mass interspersed with flickers of red. Suddenly, thousands of beady red eyes were staring at the trio. "Rats!" Richard yelled. "Thousands of them!" "Get to the tunnel's mouth," Orkin ordered, his soldiers' training coming out. "If we can catch them there, we'll have a chance. If they surround us in the cave, we're finished." Orkin drew his sword and jumped, slashing and stabbing into the horde of rodents. Richard and Melek hurried to protect his back, and together the three forged their way down the passage. For every one of the beasts they killed, another took its place. There seemed no end to them. Then Richard noticed that each time Orkin's sword slashed through a rat, its corpse vanished. Not all at once, but slowly, until there was nothing left. Looking behind him, he saw the tunnel floor was hazy with ghostly shapes that dwindled fainter and fainter until they finally popped out of existence altogether. "It's a trick," he called to Orkin. "Remember the prophecy spoke about nightmares? It must be an illusion of some sort. These things aren't real." All at once, the rats turned tail and fled, receding into the tunnel like a boiling wave of brown fur. In their place came a slithering noise, interspersed with strange scraping sounds. Then, into their field of vision, crept the biggest rat any of them had ever seen. If it was all an illusion, Richard thought to himself, then they needed to burst it like a balloon. He drew his dagger and flung it straight at the giant rat's vicious-looking face. Richard's aim was true. The dagger sunk into the rat's eye, but the creature did not disappear. Instead it swelled, bigger and bigger, bulging against the rock, until its insides burst under the strain. Blood slopped from its open mouth. For a second everything was still. Then the rat exploded into thick clouds of smoke. When the air cleared, the three found themselves in a cave made entirely from crystal. Small beads of condensation ran down the carved surfaces, adding an extra dimension to the light. A woman in robes of shimmering blue stood by a throne of prisms.
"You've done well to come this far,"
she hissed.
"but you'll go no further."
"Who are you?" Richard asked bravely.
"I am Zibella, the all-powerful,"
she boomed as she raised her hands and began a strange chant. Richard felt a numb, pins and needles pricking in his limbs. His feet were as heavy as lead, and his forehead was sweating. Streaks of cold blue light lanced from her fingertips as Zibella stopped chanting and shouted, "Here, now, forever!" Richard, Orkin and Melek could not move. The crystal walls seemed to spring away, receding with sickening speed, as if the cave were getting bigger. It was not. But the three were getting smaller, and greener, and wartier, and springier, and croakier, and web-footed. Richard raised one splay-fingered hand and stared at it through bulging eyes. A thin black tongue licked out. His tongue. He blinked. Then he hopped. The movement took him by surprise. He had landed on all fours. Then he saw two toads. One was thin with spectacles on its nose and a huge book on its back. The other toad was fatter and angrier, but both had the same puzzled expression.
What's happening?
Orkin and Melek spoke at the same time.
Zibella's turned us into toads.
Richard replied, forming the words with difficulty. For a while there was chaos as Orkin hopped about uncontrollably, and Malik struggled from under the book. In the time it took his companions to settle down, Richard sensed Golan's voice telling him to find the Book of Reversals and use the magic word from the prophecy.
Can you remember the prophecy?
Richard asked Malik urgently.
Of course!
The Malik toad croaked, and belched the words of the riddle.
Testament's beginning C.
Richard croaked as Malik finished.
Join the first letter of each line and we get Liberatus. Now we must find the Book of Reversals.
They hopped in different directions, searching frantically. It was Malik who finally found the book encased within a huge crystal. They managed to open the book and flip the pages until they found the spell. Liberatus, gleamed by the fire of candlelight, from earth a crystal sparkling bright. Dip in well water, a droplet lingers there, which turns to a bubble and rides the air. Your mortal self awaits the time to rebel. Shout Liberatus, and break the sordid spell.
That's what the end of the prophecy meant. We've got to find the 4 elements as well as the magic word,
Richard said, his lids falling heavily over his speckled toad eyes.
Let's look around the cave.
Even as he spoke, Richard realized that the 4 elements were right there beside him. A candle flickered by the book, and water dripped from the crystal walls into a shallow pool. Richard felt his powerful leg muscles tighten as he leaped at the candle. The column of wax toppled over and knocked a blue crystal into the pool. As the crystal hit the water, a perfect rainbow-colored bubble rose into the air. In the wink of an eye, Richard realized that the 4 elements had been linked.
Liberatus!
Richard shouted without hesitation. As the word left Richard's mouth, time began to unwind in reverse. The crystal walls of the cave seemed to be closing in on them at a terrifying rate. There was a subtle ripping noise as if a hole had been torn in the very fabric of the air itself. Then all movement ceased. The 3 were back to their normal shapes. Richard gave an experimental hop and jarred his heels. The magic had worked. They looked around the cave and saw Zibella perched on her throne of prisms. Her evil, ice-cold stare sent a chill through Richard and Malik, but Orkin's face was puce with rage. Orkin seized his bow, pulled out an arrow and took aim at the glowing witch. In the microsecond it took for him to release his bowfinger, Zibella had cast another spell. Spurts of flame shot from her fingers, and Orkin swiveled so that his arrow was pointing at Richard. It leaped free with a soft twang. Her spell was wasted. As soon as he saw her hand rise, Malik had guessed what would happen. His own hand had shot out to give Orkin a rough shove. It was enough to spoil the archer's aim. The arrow hissed past Richard's ear and clinked uselessly against a crystal wall. Orkin turned back to his original target. Zibella's calm features were changing. She began to laugh, first softly, then louder. As her squeals filled the air, a large crack split the ground alongside Orkin's feet, and he lowered his bow in confusion. A second crack jagged through the floor in front of him, then another, and another. The cracks began to widen into gaping crevices, whose edges crumbled and fell in on themselves. Crystal columns teetered and fell. Above it all, the crash of shattering crystal. The groan of tortured bedrock, the rumble of falling boulders rang the high, clear screech of Zibella's mad laughter. Her mirth came in spurts and jags, ear-splitting cackles of merriment that rang remorselessly through her crystal cavern. At the same time, she began to change, her icy beauty turning into the withered features of an old hag. Zibella's hair thinned and shrank back on her scalp. Her cheeks wrinkled and sank. Her eyes pouched and glazed over into opaque pebbles. Her whole body hunched over, and even her clothes disintegrated into rags. Soon she was little more than a withered black shape that capered madly from crystal to crystal. Richard looked around in desperation. The floor had cracked like crazy paving into a number of islands that grew smaller and further apart with each second. They had only one chance. "Follow me," he shouted, and launched himself into the abyss. And that is the end of book number 10. So, how did you go with the Ancestral Challenge? Were you able to find all of the hidden objects? And do you think Zibella was based on the Rats of Hamlin, Morgan Le Fay, or the Banshee? Tune into the Ancestral Challenge next week where I will reveal the answer. In this issue, there were no letter tokens to collect, but there will be more, so stay posted. Thanks for watching this episode of Skullbrain TV. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button and ring that little bell icon to be notified when the next episode is released. And until next time, as always, stay tuned and stay skullbrained.